But we speak now to the Presidential Climate Commission's Dhesigen Naidoo on government's state of readiness for such events. Mr. Naidoo, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. Can I start with what meetings or conversations are being had at this time at national government level in order to respond to what is happening in these two provinces, Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal?
Well, good evening, and good evening to your viewers as well. There are two sets of things that are in motion, of course. I mean, the first is the immediate thing around the disaster response. And here the National Disaster Management Center is directly involved with both the KwaZulu-Natal government as well as the city government around the immediate measures that need to be taken to deal with the disaster. And this is happening simultaneously in other parts of the country as well. But we're also looking at the longer term around this. And the longer term is around organizing for us to have a much better understanding and a much more predictable way in which we can engage these disasters before they happen, so that we can have the right mitigation measures in place in order for that to happen.
Yeah. Let's talk about the immediate measures that you speak of. What is it that is going to be done by government in the immediate?
Well, the protocols that are in place, and unfortunately, we've had this so frequently that we've had to have it in place and use fairly often. In fact, every year since 2022 now, we've had a major event in the KwaZulu-Natal province. In fact, every year for the last decade, we've had a major event at some place in the country. Those immediate measures is about an immediate assessment, and that assessment is being done. And then the response measures that go along with that around the issue of getting people to safer places, to save some of the infrastructure before the disaster management kicks into the full phase. Part of the assessment is around whether or not to declare a disaster, of course, and that releases a different protocol of funding in order to respond to the emergency.
We're going to talk long term, but people right now, Mr. Naidoo, are being housed in community centers, churches. It's just the most inconvenient of situations. If I take you, for example, to East London /Gqeberha, the people there saying instead of being accommodated in the houses that government has built there, they are forced to live in shack dwellings because it's just taking an inordinate amount of time for them to be moved. What can be done by government to make sure that there are areas that are almost designated to these kinds of situations when disaster strikes?
Look, there are multiple levels of this that have to be engaged, right? I mean, the first is that we are becoming much more clear about the areas in our different cities and towns that are more vulnerable to these events than not. And those areas really need to be reorganized around the spatial planning so that people do not live there, to reduce that vulnerability. The second thing is that you are right. Part of the disaster management review process that is currently underway, and I'm sure it will be completed into the new administration, is around not only organizing for us to have better climate information around what is going to happen, but to have much more robust response mechanisms around it. So an area like Gqeberha, for example, has the unusual situation of being through a prolonged drought and is now in the middle of a flood. And these, if you like, are two sides of the same coin, and they exacerbate one another. So when you have a long period of drought, you have a drying up of the surface layers of the soil. And when the rain actually does fall, it runs as a flash flood of the surface. And some of that you're already seeing this week in that part of the country. But the idea of having permanent places to take refugees of these events I'm not sure that that is in the cards. Certainly, people will be thinking about it, but we're hopeful that we'll get our adaptation measures in place in a robust enough way not to actually permanently need that.
Yeah. I want to go back to one of the statements you made earlier when you said every year in the last decade, particularly in the area of KwaZulu-Natal, we have had the same weather events. How do you respond then to criticism that says response mechanisms should be in place, particularly in KZN, to respond immediately so that people are immediately taken care of?
You know, that is a fair comment, but I think what we are finding, and this is not restricted to South Africa alone. I mean, the entire Southern African region, as we speak, is a combination of floods, like South Africa, like Kenya, and droughts. You have a food crisis that's being declared in Zimbabwe, and a drought declared in Zambia, which is a water-rich country in general. And all of this is on the back of the fact that climate change is becoming really, really rapid. So in 2023, and we now have the audited figures, the average temperature of 2023 was plus 1.48 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. Let me contextualize this. Our planning was that we were planning for 1.5 degrees increase by 2100. We're already at 1.48 degrees. So the algorithms are very different, which means we have to do rapid things in order to respond to the fact that there's a high energy inside the atmosphere, inside the oceans, that are leading to these high energy events like these surging storms and tornadoes. And yes, we have to reorganize the whole way we respond to those disasters, because the intensity levels are way above what we had planned for, and the frequency is way above what we planned for. So that critique about having a whole new system in place is valid, and that's something we're starting to plan and work on very rapidly.
Dhesigen Naidoo, thank you very much for your time. Is with the Presidential Climate Commission.